Okay, so Claire's going to be doing the talk today, and it's about Jesus and Jesus as a teacher specifically. And it got me thinking about like teachers from my past and the experience of teachers. Yeah, yeah, a couple
I
of
know,
teachers in the room.
we got lots of teachers in the room. Be careful what you say.
So I wasn't really naughty in school, but I was never really like a teacher's pet either. So there was no like one teacher that I got on with in particular. But I'll always remember how the dynamic changed when I kind of went to secondary school, and especially sixth form. And a lot of the teachers who I wasn't really close to, they kind of treat you with a bit more respect. And I think because you're getting nearer to being like an adult, they actually have some like adult conversations with you. And when you're talking about university, they're actually like giving you advice, and you're actually taking notice of their advice. And then you realize that actually these teachers aren't there just to like punish you. They actually care about you, a lot of them.
A lot of them, I love that. Not all of them.
I'm sure a lot of them, almost most of them. But what about you? You got any thoughts?
Yeah, so I was really thinking, and there wasn't one teacher who I remember like, oh, so-and-so taught me the best maths I've ever learned in my life. Like, I remember everything about this. I think it was more like their attitude. So in school, I had, in primary school, there were loads of really nice teachers that I remember, but it's because they were really nice to me, and I was really shy when I was a child. And I was just like, I didn't like to put my hand up and didn't like to say a lot. And they kind of knew that. You know, as you get older, like when you were a child, you don't really understand that. But looking back, they were just really nice and like took me under their wing and just were really gentle, I suppose. So yeah, those are the people I remember. And like sometimes, because where I grew up is like a really tiny little town, you know, you see them sometimes and they still remember you and like come and speak to you. So that's nice. So yeah, it's just the people who were nice to me. That's what I remember.
Yeah, I think, the relationship is really important, the relationship you got with your teacher, and I think that level of respect as well. I think if you respect your teacher, you're more likely to kind of listen to what they're saying. I'll always remember this one teacher was like really funny and got on really well with the class, and he almost felt like one of the class in that sense, and then we actually paid attention to him when the laughter and the joking was over. Then we knew it was serious time, but he'd almost kind of captured his audience at that point. So yeah, humour I think is really strong. But yeah, it's all about like connecting with people and like knowing your audience, like I said, and like knowing how to connect to a class full of boys, like being more of a lad with them, to connect with them. And like, yeah, I don't know, I didn't have like one teacher like you said, but now I'm thinking a lot of them stood out for different reasons. And I think, every teacher is different as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gav's just writing notes in the front now, like what he's going to do when he goes back on Monday. With kids, like, what can I do? How are they going to like me more? No, let's strike that one off.
So yeah, Claire's going to talk to us about another famous teacher, probably the most famous, to be honest, probably the one that the most books have been written about and is the most talked about. So
guess who? Anybody know?
So yeah, one of the greatest teachers, obviously, and he used different techniques, which I'm sure Claire will delve into. And whenever you're ready, Claire, you ready? Thanks.
Okay, we've rearranged the stage a bit today just to get everyone a bit confused and a bit out of sorts because we like different things. So thanks, Josh and Soph. It's really interesting, isn't it? The teachers that we remember and what stands out about them. I wonder if I asked you about the teachers you had in your life, who would stand out to you? Why would they be memorable? Would it be for good reasons or for bad reasons? And if you're talking about Kate and Gav, they've got to all be good reasons, all right, because they'll get upset. Gareth actually went to the same school as me, and I was thinking, Gareth, I wonder if you remember the same teachers I remember, and if the memorable parts were the same. I don't know, we'll have to compare notes later, but it's interesting, isn't it? I bet we've probably taken different things from different teachers over that time. But we read in Scripture that when Jesus taught, some of the crowd were astonished by the teacher. I'm not sure, actually, when we talk about how we describe our teacher, I don't think I actually would describe any of the teachers as astonishing. I don't know, would you describe any of the teachers you've had as astonishing? I don't know. All right, I really hope by now that you're aware that we're looking at a series on the life of Jesus, looking at his life, and as he walked on this earth, and about what difference that can make to our lives today. So when Jesus walked on this earth, he did so much, didn't he? We've looked at lots, and we're going to continue to look at lots. But one of the major things that he did was to teach his followers, and those who would listen, about how to live in this world and how to best prepare ourselves for the world to come. And that's going to be our focus today. Jesus the teacher, and specifically the attitudes and behaviours that he calls us to live with. So bear with me as I just share some of the things that have stood out to me as I've pondered this topic. So as I read and pondered Jesus as a teacher, I began to think about what made Jesus a great teacher, and why did he stand out? Josh and Soph have shared some of the things that made their teachers stand out. But why was Jesus such a great teacher, and why did he stand out? Well, firstly, I believe it's because he practiced what he taught. He didn't just walk into a room, he didn't just issue some commands and then go off and do his own thing. You know, there's that old adage, and I always get the wrong way round, don't do as I do, but do as I say. And actually, that wasn't Jesus, was it? He practiced what he preached. You know, Jesus taught us all to be humble. And then we can read in John 13 how Jesus humbled himself. He washed the disciples' feet, and he even washed the feet of the man who was about to betray him. Jesus taught us, very relevantly, to be peacemakers. And then we read in Matthew 26 how when Jesus was arrested, one of his disciples cut off a soldier's ear. And what did Jesus do? He healed him, he put it back, and he told his disciples to put their swords away. And I think the most obvious one is in Matthew 5, he taught us to love our enemies. And then he went and died for his enemies. So he definitely practiced what he taught. And secondly, as I pondered why Jesus was a great teacher, it was because he had the best vantage point, much like being on the top of a mountain, looking down. And as I was thinking of this, as you know, I love the youth on a Friday night. I love the fun. I love the energy. And a couple of years ago, we took them away to Llanelli for a fun activity weekend. And I'm just looking around thinking there were a couple of you there. Karen, Gav, James was there. I can't remember who else. And on the first night, we went out to this big field nearby where there was this mound towards the edge of the field. And the whole point of the game was we split up into teams, and they were attacking teams, and each team took it in turns to defend the structure on this mound. It was quite simple. All the other people had to do was not get caught and get into the structure, and you know, you got points for your team. So all the teams played, and thankfully, my team was last, very memorably. And we'd had the chance to watch for the best techniques, and had decided the best technique was to command the team from the top of the mound. So I stood on the top of the mound, spread the team out below, and just screamed instructions. There's one over there, there's one over there. Quick, get them, get them. And as you know, I'm not at all competitive. So it didn't matter to me that we won and not a single person got past the defences. But yeah, we won't say what that teaches the youth about winning and losing and taking part. But I did mention it a few times in the weekend. But my point being, I actually stood on the top of that mound. I could see where everyone was when they were moving about. And being on the top of the mountain is such a great vantage point, isn't it? But seriously, what an opportunity Jesus has provided for us. You know, we have someone who has that mountaintop perspective of life, offering us wisdom and teaching on the best way that we can live that life. You know, when we're looking for help to navigate the challenges of life, do we first look in the teachings of Jesus to find out what he tells us to do? I was thinking back to 2020 when COVID hit, and we were all thinking, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? How are we going to survive? And you know, I thought about it, and the messages coming out from the government were put others first. Think of others. How can we help others? Look out for other people's needs. We're going to get through this together if we all support each other. And I thought, actually, isn't that all in Scripture? If I asked you now, I'm sure lots of you could just shout out, come up lots of verses. That advice was right there, already written in the Scripture. And then another example, many of us are caught up in the first world trap, I guess, of never feeling quite like we've got enough, always striving for something else, looking around, seeing what other people have got, never quite being content, looking for happiness, perhaps sometimes in the wrong places. But you know, the teaching in the Bible speaks right into that situation as well. In many places, we are told to be thankful for what we have, not to look around and think what we don't have, but if we're being thankful for what we have, we won't worry about the rest. And one of the commandments is not to covet what others have, to find happiness in Jesus and not in the things of this world. And I know I'm kind of picking a bit here on obvious examples, but I do totally believe that the Bible contains all the answers for the best life imaginable. It's for us to know what's written in the Bible so that when we need to know how to deal with life and the best way to do it, we know what he said. Okay, so as I was reading around the teachings of Jesus in preparation for this talk, I noticed something that I've never noticed before, and I wonder if any of you have. I noticed that when Jesus taught, he often taught sitting down. It says in Matthew 5, verse 1, now, when he saw the crowds, he went up on a mountaintop and he sat down. And my first thought was, really? So there's Jesus up on a mountaintop or wherever he is with thousands of people and no microphone. How many microphones have we had here today for this room? And then he sits down. How could he possibly teach and be heard? We struggle in a room of this size. I still don't have the answer to that, but I guess that's not my point. My point is that Jesus grew up in the Jewish culture and the rabbis were the teachers. And sitting actually was a posture that gave authority to their teachings. So Jesus chose to sit, to teach, to emphasize the authority that he actually had to teach with. So our takeaway today is not that I should go and sit on the chair where Josh and Sophie's been, because that's how we should be teaching. When we walk into a classroom today, the teachers often aren't sitting down, are they? They're standing up to communicate with the class. And if we want to teach with authority in today's culture, it's probably a bit more about standing up, and that's what people understand as authority. But our takeaway is that Jesus had authority to teach, and he adopted that posture to show that in his teachings. So when we look at the teachings of Jesus, I think it is so important that we ask what it meant to the people that Jesus was teaching, what it meant in their day, what it meant in their culture, before we can begin to possibly understand what it means in our culture today. And we're really blessed, aren't we? We're really lucky. We've got commentaries, we've got study Bibles, we've got life application Bibles. In our house group, I always refer that as the answer Bible, because any question anyone asks, you can consult the little bit at the bottom and it'll tell you the answer. But more than that, actually, we've got each other, and we can help each other understand the teachings in context. And that's why it's an important part of our culture in Gateway that everyone is part of a midweek group, because we've got each other and we should be getting together and helping each other to really understand what it is that Jesus has taught us. So I want to say again, if you're not part of a midweek group, then come and see me afterwards, because I would so love to help you get connected in with one of them. You'll be pleased to hear that we're not going to look at all of the teachings of Jesus today, because that would take us somewhat a little while. That is a whole series in itself, and hey, maybe something we could look at in the future. But we're going to spend a little time looking at the first part of Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus gave the Beatitudes, the behaviours and attitudes that Jesus wants us to live by. And I hadn't noticed when I came in earlier, but as I was sat there and we were singing and I was looking behind me, how brilliant, Connect Life have had banners made for our service today. I was very thoughtful of them, I thought. But before we dig into detail then, let's read it. Matthew 5, verses 1 to 12 says, now when Jesus saw the crowd, he went up on a mountainside and, notice this, sat down. His disciples came to him and he began to teach them. He said this, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. And blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And sometimes I think when we want to understand what the Bible is teaching, I find it really helpful to go and read, not just in one version, but go and look at what other versions say about that very same passage. And I have to say, when I read what the Message translation, or paraphrase, however you want to refer to it, said, I really feel it helps us understand this passage a lot better. So if it's okay, I'm going to read it again, but in the Message translation. So that's a challenge for anyone who's only brought one version of the Bible, because you can't follow along this time. When Jesus saw his ministry drawing huge crowds, he climbed a hillside. Those who were apprenticed to him, the committed, they climbed with him as well. Arriving at a quiet place, he sat down, and taught his climbing companions. And this is what he said: "You're blessed when you're at the end of your rope. With less of you, there is more of God and his rule. You're blessed when you feel you've lost what is most dear to you. Only then can you be embraced by the one most dear to you. You're blessed when you're content with who you are. No more, no less. That's the moment you find yourself proud owners of everything that can't be bought. You're blessed when you've worked up a good appetite for God. He's food and drink in the best meal you'll ever eat. You're blessed when you care. At the moment of being careful, you find yourself cared for. You're blessed when you get your inside world, that's your mind and your heart, put right. Then you can see God in the outside world. You're blessed when you can show people how to cooperate instead of compete or fight. Then you will discover who you really are and your place in God's family. You're blessed when you're committed to God, when your commitment to God provokes persecution. The persecution drives you even deeper into God's kingdom. Not only that, count yourself blessed every time people put you down or throw you out or speak lies about you or discredit you. What it means is that the truth is too close for comfort, and they're uncomfortable. You can be glad when that happens. You can give a cheer even, for though they don't like it, God does. And all heaven applauds. And know that you're in good company. God's prophets and witnesses have also gotten into this kind of trouble. I love that translation. I think it really does sort of bring it out and help explain it a little bit more. But one of the key things that the commentators note about these teachings is that they were instructions given to those who'd already chosen to be in God's kingdom. They were given to the disciples and others who had chosen to follow him. In Gateway many years ago, I think actually it was one of the first kind of teaching CVs that you were having in Gateway. When I first came to Gateway, you talked about belong, believe and behave. I don't know if some of you have been around for a while remember that. We wanted to be a place where people could come and feel like they belonged. And as they did, they might come to believe in God and all that he'd done for them. Then it was out of this newfound faith and hearing his teachings that they chose to behave. You know, as the church, so not Gateway, but the broader church in the past, we've tried, I think, to get people to behave before they've come to know the amazing love of their Father. These teachings were intended as a guide for those already committed to following Christ. And let's be honest, even with God's help, we're never really going to attain all of those things that have been talked about. So I don't think we should be expecting people to follow the ways of Jesus, the ways Jesus lays out, without knowing his grace, forgiveness and love to help them as they do it. You know, when I was a teenager, I went along to a church youth group, and we were having a discussion one night with some of the leaders. And I really remember there was one leader there who was saying he didn't actually believe all the bits about Jesus being God, the bits about Jesus dying to save us, and you might wonder why he was leading a church youth group, but we'll skirt over that. He just believed that if the world were to follow the teachings of Jesus, it actually would be a far better place. Well, what an interesting perspective, actually, that someone who doesn't believe in the whole of Christianity actually thinks they haven't chosen to follow Jesus, but they believe his teachings would lead the world to be a better place. And that all sounds great, doesn't it, in principle? Everyone, whether they believe or not, following these great teachings. But being completely honest, again, if I didn't have Jesus walking beside me, if I didn't have his Spirit living within me, convicting me, Spirit prompting me and loving me, I wouldn't stand a chance at being able to follow and live up to the teachings. You know, I often fail, and I'm sure you'd probably all say the same. So let's not forget at the outset that these teachings are intended for those who believe. And these great teachings of Jesus were about what life in God's kingdom looked like. A lifestyle that is actually radically different from the rest of society. A life that's very countercultural. You know, in his teachings, Jesus often commends those whom the world would dismiss as losers and as wimps. The values of God's kingdom are often just so very different to the ones in our world. So the Beatitudes consist of 8 statements, and the commentators believe that the style and structure of the Beatitudes was important, as they believe Jesus intended to make them a memorable list of teachings. Perhaps think of them as a pocket guide to the right way to live. So let's think of them as that today, a pocket guide as the right way to live. So let's dig very quickly into some of these attitudes and behaviours and see a little bit more of what they look like. So verse 3 said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Or again, as the Message verse puts it, "You're blessed when you're at the end of your rope. With less of you, there is more of God and his rule." You know, when God talks about the poor in spirit, he's not saying that being poor is a blessing. Let's just say that first of all. But he's referring to people's relationship with God. He was referring to those who recognize that they are absolutely nothing without God. People who would gladly accept God's rule in their life. They're the people he's talking about. And that was the opposite to the pride of the Pharisees of the day had in their own virtue. Opposite to those people who have arrogant self-confidence and ride roughshod over other people's interests. Opposite to those who rely on themselves and in that way kind of treat God as somewhat irrelevant. You know, what Jesus is saying is those of us who recognize and accept God's rule in our lives, we are going to be part of God's kingdom. So then secondly, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Again, Jesus isn't saying that we'll be blessed if we're mourning, but we'll be happy and blessed because we are comforted. We are comforted by living in the promise that there are better times ahead. You know, for those of God's people who find their current situations intolerable, and I'm sure there are many Christians in Ukraine and Russia today who are finding their situations intolerable. Jesus is also reminding us that for God's people, there will be times of rejoicing, but their situation in this world is generally one of disadvantage and therefore mourning. And let's note, the mourning actually isn't just about the loss of someone who matters to us, but we can mourn over situations as well. And maybe that's you today, and you need to receive the blessing of being comforted by your Father today. Again, this is a call to recognize that we need God in the situations that we face in life. And I love the way, again, that the Message version expresses the verse. You're blessed when you feel you've lost what is most dear to you, because only then can you be embraced by the one who is most dear to you. So then the third beatitude says, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." It's the meek who will have a place in God's kingdom. Those who are meek are not arrogant, they're not aggressive, and they're not people who throw their weight around. Self-exertion, actually, I think we'll all agree, is not a Christian virtue, is it? However, meekness, let's not confuse that with weakness, because it absolutely isn't. Actually, meekness is comparable with great strength. Meek people choose to wait on God, and they're not scheming and trying to sort things out themselves. You know, it's these people who have a place in God's kingdom, not those who assert themselves. I don't know if you're listening to me here and you're thinking, yeah, this is definitely countercultural, isn't it? To be successful in our world, we often associate that with people who push themselves forward and maybe even stand on the heads of other people and put other people down to get there. You know, there's some challenging stuff about the way in which we as Christians are called to behave. And then fourthly, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they'll be filled. Again, I love the way the Message Bible puts it. You're blessed when you've worked up a good appetite for God. You know, disciples are people who are eager to live as God requires. Disciples are people who prioritize living by every word that comes from God. To hunger and thirst is actually to have a deep longing inside. I think we need to say, though, we can't achieve righteousness by strong efforts. We should do our best, but ultimately I think we all need to know righteousness is actually a gift from God. So what is this verse saying then? It's saying that when we long for righteousness, God will fill that longing. It's for us to seek wholeheartedly and to long and let God fill us with his righteousness. Okay, so let me just do a quick summary of where we're at with the Beatitudes so far, because I appreciate we're moving fast. I'm not expecting you to recite the whole thing and bring it back, but hopefully you're taking little bits here and there that will get you thinking. So a quick summary. Jesus wants us to live with an attitude of humility, knowing our need for God, and looking forward to the fulfillment of living in his wonderful kingdom. And with the attitude of recognizing that things may not be the best, but with God there are definitely better days to come. His kingdom will be for the meek, those who don't push themselves forward, but those who wait on God instead. And for those who have a deep longing for righteousness. Actually, a good way to summarize these first 4 Beatitudes is it's about recognizing our need for dependence on God. And when I was preparing for the day, I was thinking, actually, I was reminded of another of Jesus' teachings in John 15, the vine and the branches. Do you all recall that? We haven't got time to read it now, but perhaps go home, read John 15 and remind yourself of that parable. And this passage teaches us to be successful at following the teachings of Jesus is not about trying harder. It's about abiding more with Jesus. I think we really need to hear that. You know, how often have you set aside time, spent time with Jesus, been in his presence, really sought him, and not left feeling inspired and changed to be more like him? You know, a number of years ago, I started journaling about my walk with Jesus, and it's actually been such a blessing to look back and see how it's when I've given it all to God, when I've left the outcome to him, it's then that the fruit has come. There's an author, Max Lucado, who I like listening to, and when speaking on the topic of the vine and the branches, he said this, he said, hold tighter. Our goal is not to bear fruit, but to stay attached. Don't beat ourselves up about the fruit, but get more attached, because then the fruit will come. You know, the key to these Beatitudes that we're talking about is recognizing our need and our dependence on God. So that's the first 4. Then the rest of the Beatitudes are the outworking of that dependence. So firstly, it says, blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. You know, mercy and forgiveness are very closely linked, aren't they? Those who are merciful have a generous attitude and are willing to see things from other people's points of view. They're perhaps not quick to take offense or to gloat over others. And I also think here that Jesus, when he talks about being merciful, isn't saying every once in a while be a bit merciful to people. He's talking about us being wired to show mercy in all situations and all aspects of life. And you know, as we show mercy, his promise to us is the mercy will be shown to us. And then Jesus teaches, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. You know, our hearts are where our moral and our religious convictions can be found, aren't they? And Jesus is calling for purity at the very center of our being. Again, I think the message puts this really well. You're blessed when you get your inside world, that's your mind and your heart, put right. Then you can see God in the outside world. Wow, I love the blessing that's spoken of here. Get your hearts right, and we'll see God. That's brilliant, isn't it? Get your hearts right, and we can see God. You know, maybe Jesus is referring here to the visionary type experience that John had on Patmos. Or maybe he is just talking about our relationship and knowing Jesus. But for sure, he is definitely giving a great promise that one day we'll see him face to face in the life to come. And wow, what a day that will be. Don't we all agree what a day that will be to see Jesus face to face in the world to come? So earlier, I spoke of how I believed that the teachings of Jesus had relevance for our life today. And this next one, I'm sure you'll agree, is so relevant to the current situation going on in the world, going on in Ukraine. Jesus teaches this, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. You know, let's hear that. God's heart is for peace. And again, the Message translation expands further on this. It says, you're blessed when you can show people how to cooperate instead of compete or fight. You know, Jesus actually is calling us to go beyond having a peaceful disposition, but actively seeking to make peace, bringing together those who've been estranged, those who are against each other, to be peacemakers. Let's hear that, to be peacemakers, and not just simply peacekeepers. It goes so much further. And then I thought, was God referring here to wars or maybe just to personal quarrels? I think absolutely both. Definitely referring to them both. And we also read in Paul's writings in Romans 12 that as far as it depends on us, we should live at peace. You know, as children of God, we reflect the character of God, and his character seeks peace. I hope I'm getting that across. Peace is at the heart of God's character. It's easy to see, isn't it, how we could be peacemakers in our personal quarrels. Might not be easy to do, let me say, don't misunderstand that, but it is easy to see how we can perhaps try and seek peace. But what influence can we have as peacemakers in the current war that's going on in the Ukraine? Now, I was reading an article yesterday from Christians remaining in the Ukraine to serve as Russia invades. And the first thing that stood out in this article was, a lot of us here have got the YouVersion app, haven't we? And they reported that there was an 11% increase in searches among Ukrainian and Russian Christians for the word fear. But more strikingly, there was a 44% increase in searches for peace. I don't think that's surprising, is it? But that is what the Christians in those countries are just searching for now. But what can we do? Well, we can pray. Actually, we need to pray, don't we? I don't know if you're aware that Archbishop was asking Christians to set aside time to pray for peace. So it was great, Soph, at the beginning that we could start as a church gathering together and standing alongside our brothers and sisters and praying with them. And I wasn't surprised as I read the article that the Christians who were remaining there were asking us to join them in praying that God would stop the aggressors. That didn't surprise me. But what did surprise me was second on their list of prayer requests was for peace of mind, to respond with Christian character and not from human hate. The Christians that are remaining in the Ukraine to serve God there are asking us, their brothers and sisters around the world, to pray that they will respond with Christian character. You know, we can pray actually that they might be the peacemakers in their situation. And let's remember, actually, that God often uses unlikely people to bring about great change. So I think the message from that today is, let's pray that God will use the Christians in Ukraine, in Russia, to be his peacemakers. And let's be expectant that he can do amazing things through his people in those countries. And let's uplift them in prayer and support them in that way. And then lastly, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. You know, Jesus isn't referring here to any persecution, but he's specifically referring to those who are committed to God's cause and are persecuted for that. Those of us who find ourselves persecuted should be joyful. Sounds interesting, but why should we be joyful? We should be joyful because we're going to receive some great rewards in heaven. You know, God's goodness overflows to those who are persecuted for his cause. It says that. We read actually about how God's prophets were treated, and let's be honest, they were pretty much persecuted, weren't they? God's prophets. Let's remember, it's a privilege to be a servant of God. And in the days to come, we will receive great rewards in heaven alongside all the other great men and women of faith who've suffered before us. And I believe that in the last beatitude, Jesus is saying that we should not lock ourselves away in a holy huddle from society, but we should engage in it, bring in something of God's kingdom here, even though it's likely to bring hardship and persecution. It absolutely will be worth it. There's so much more I could have said from all the things that I've been reading. So maybe we need another series. Perhaps we could call it The Distinctiveness of Discipleship or something. But yeah, I'll stop there now. But one last thing before I hand back over to Kate and the band. When I was doing my Bible readings this week, there was a reflection on the word, and I'm going to pronounce it wrong because I pronounce lots of words wrong, Shema. It was a Hebrew word that's common in scriptures apparently. And it means both listening and doing all wrapped up in one word. It's a call to pay attention to not just hear, but to respond as well. And as I listened to that this week, as I was reading about it, I was reminded of that passage in James 1, verses 22 to 25, which says, "Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at their face in a mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they've heard but doing it, they will be blessed in all that they do." Being a Christian is absolutely important to invest time in reading God's word, the Bible. You know, I was blessed and inspired actually to go along to lots of brethren youth camps as a teenagers, where they knew their scriptures inside out, and I was so inspired to want to do the same. But actually, just knowing them isn't enough. The Pharisees knew their scriptures, but Jesus calls us to do so much more, to be like him and to practice what he's taught us. Jesus calls us to let it shape and to change our lives. So quickly, in summary, what makes Jesus such a great teacher? He practiced what he preached, and he had a great vantage point. The teachings of Jesus can teach us as much about living in the world today as they taught the disciples about living in Israel 2,000 years ago. These teachings were for those who already had decided to follow Jesus. In the Beatitudes, Jesus was teaching the disciples about the attitudes and behaviours that would be in God's kingdom for eternity and that we should choose to reflect in the world today. These attitudes and behaviours were countercultural in his day, and actually they still are today. And living in this way, let's not be blind, may well bring hardship in this life, but it will bring great treasures in the life to come. And then lastly, let's not just be hearers of Jesus' teachings, but let's be doers of them as well. So thanks, guys. I'm going to ask the band to come back up now.